Hello, this is Cheryl. Welcome back to another video. I'm so glad you're here. In this video, I'm going to show you some different embossing techniques. Now, I just had a video that I released a few days ago that talked about different techniques with 2D embossing folders. 2D embossing folders are folders that just have a lower edge and a raised edge. So there's just a high point and a low point. You can check out that video to look at those techniques there. In this video, we're going to talk about 3D embossing folders. 3D embossing folders are a lot thicker than the 2D ones, and they have a lot more dimension. There's not just one high point and one low point. There's curves, there's texture. It's got a lot more interest than just a regular embossing folder. And there's some fun techniques that you can use these folders for, and I'm going to show you some of my favorites. So let's move these cards to the side, and I'm going to quickly show you how you use a 3D embossing folder. So you're going to take a sprayer, you're going to mist your paper on both sides and put it into your embossing folder. If you want it placed in a certain spot, you can take a look through your folder and see exactly where it's going to be placed. Let's grab my machine here. Now, in order to use a 3D embossing folder, I've got my Big Shot here. I'm going to open tab number 2. I only need one of these plates because this embossing folder is so much thicker than the regular ones. If I were to try to use 2, I wouldn't be able to get it under here. So I'm going to put my plate with my paper in there, and I'm going to run it through. Now, because there's so much detail in these embossing folders, I'm going to run it through a few times just to really press that detail into that cardstock. And there we go. So that is what it looks like plain. In this video, you're going to see all different ways to enhance that. This, because I misted it, I do need to let it dry before I use it for anything. But let's go take a look at the techniques. I'm not going to complete each one of the cards. I'm just going to show you the technique and then show you a card made with that technique so you can see what it would look like in use. Let's go take All right, so for this one here, we're going to step up that inking the embossing folder, and we're also going to stamp a image stamp on there. Now, this is the script stamp that I'm using, and keep in mind, if you're using a legible script stamp, your writing is going to be backwards. This particular one, you can't even read it when it's stamped forwards anyways. So I'm just using it for a little bit of extra texture. The folder that we're going to be using is a 3D embossing folder, but this would work with a 2D one as well. The same process, same steps. This is my folder here, and you can really easily see which is the side that has the background raised and which is the side that has the image raised. And if you find it hard to see, you can just feel it, and you can feel the smooth part of the background, and on this side you can feel the rough part of the image being raised. So we're going to be inking on the background side. I'm taking my Oxide ink pads here. Now, what I forgot to mention in the last video is these ink pads that I'm using are water soluble. You can use a dye ink pad, or this is an Oxide, which is a pigment dye blend. Either one will work, but it's better to use a water soluble pad because then you're going to be easily able to clean your embossing folder afterwards. If you use permanent ink, chances are your ink is going to dry before you can even transfer it onto your paper. The other thing is sometimes when you have permanent ink cleaners, sometimes they're a little bit oily, and that's hard to get off the plastic. So best to use a dye-based ink or a water-soluble ink. So I'm going to ink my background stamp here with some brown ink because I want it to have some contrast. I want to be able to see it. This particular stamp actually is not big enough to go over the entire piece or the entire folder, so I'm going to do it in 2 little steps here. I'm just going to take a baby wipe anywhere I see some of that turquoisey color. Oops. And then let's ink it again. Now my paper is smaller, so I probably could have just stamped it one time and it would have fit where I'm going to put my paper, but this way I don't necessarily need to worry about that. I can put my paper wherever I want it to. And I don't have my stamp on an acrylic block. If you feel more comfortable with it, you absolutely can do that. For this particular one, I was comfortable just holding it in my hand. This bottom part, we're not going to see a whole lot of it, and I'm not exactly sure what part we're going to see and what we're not, so I'm just going to stamp all of it again, and that way we've got as much as I need. All right, let's put the stamp to the side. I'm going to put the folder up there, grab my machine. Once again, I'm not using the bottom plate, so I only have my multi-purpose platform with the folder or the top tab open. I'm going to take my paper and put it in my embossing folder, but before I do that, I'm going to mist it. So off camera, I'm going to mist each side twice. It doesn't need to be wet. We're just dampening those paper fibers. And then I'm going to lay it down. Now I want to try to be careful not to move it once I've laid it down, because I don't want that ink to smear. And then roll it back and forth. There we go. Isn't that cool? I just love how you can get the image transferred over, and it just adds so much more interest to the background here. So you can see in my background, I didn't do anything to the flowers because I thought there was enough busyness and enough interest in the background that I liked them just plain. So I simply added a sentiment to the bottom. Your folder here, you could take a baby wipe and clean it this way, or a wet cloth. The easiest way is to go take it to a tap, run it under some running water, and then use a towel to dry it. That's the quickest and easiest way I found to clean. All right, so we're going to do some double embossing. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to emboss a brick pattern into my full sheet of paper, and then I'm going to use the roses one. You're going to lose some of the detail from the bricks because the roses one, it just flattens it anyways. But when we go and ink it, some of that detail comes back out, which makes it look really interesting. And again, you can use any combination of folders. I just thought the roses would look really, really cool with a brick background. So the first thing I'm going to do is emboss my brick background. This again is a 3D folder, so I'm going to have my multi-purpose platform with the tab 2 open. No bottom plate, I'm just going to emboss the top one. Now normally I would mist my paper first, but because I'm double embossing this, and because the roses one is going to flatten some of the embossing from the bricks here, I'm just going to emboss this one without misting it, and I will mist it for the roses. So there's the brick, and it's got a ton of detail in it, and we're going to lose some of that, but that's okay. So my folder is right here. I'm going to mist each side of the paper twice. Place it where I want on the roses, and I'm going to make sure that I'm placing it so that the roses are going to emboss out. I want to get a little bit more of that top flower there, so I'm going to just move it a moment. And then let's emboss this. And there we go. So you can see we've lost some of the detail of the brick. Some of that is going to come back as we ink it, but because we just misted the paper, I'm going to let this dry completely. So I'm going to give it 5 to 10 minutes for the water in there to dry, because if we go and ink it right now, the wetness is going to make that ink a lot darker. So I want to be doing it on dry paper. So I'll see you in a moment once this is all dried. All right, our embossed background is dry now, and I'm going to ink it. Now I'm going to use ink blending brushes again, and do it with a very, very light hand until you get a feel for how much ink gets on the brush from that ink pad. It's always, once again, it's always easier to add more ink than it is to wish you hadn't had it in a certain area. So I'm doing the burgundy color for the flowers first. See, I got a little bit of a swirl there because I got a little bit heavy-handed, but that's okay. And this is definitely one that I wouldn't be using an ink pad directly to the paper for, simply because I don't want an I don't want it to get too dark, and the texture from the background from the bricks is only going to come out with a really, really light hand with a brush. If I were a little bit too heavy-handed, I think it would ink the whole thing and you wouldn't see it, because the texture itself from the brick, because it was flattened a little bit, is fairly subtle. But it is also something that I think you do need to ink it a bit in order to have that come out. So you can see some of that has come out, and I don't go right to the edges. It's impossible with brushes to go right to the edges. Just the suggestion of color for me is enough. So again, for the leaves, light-handed, and you see that I got burgundy on the edges of the leaves. I don't worry about that. For me, it doesn't take anything away from the look of the whole thing. And I think you get enough suggestion of color that you know what it is. And as you're working, if there's an area that you find needs a little bit more ink, go back and just add a little bit more ink. But even when I'm adding more ink, I'm not really adding much pressure to it. I'm still staying fairly light-handed with it. And you can see on my sample card, I didn't even add a sentiment to this. This to me has got enough detail and enough interest to it that I would put a sentiment or something inside my card. I wouldn't put it on the front. All right, and I'm just gonna go back with the burgundy and just darken some of those edges up a little bit. And this is where you can get a little bit more heavy-handed. I'm just focusing on the edges. I'm not focusing inside. And really, this is more to frame it than anything. I think it gives it a kind of a little bit of a vignette type look when you darken the outsides. And the mat that I am on is a silicone, it's actually a baking mat that I got from Costco. There's all sorts of different mats that you can work on. I do have one from Ranger that's a tan color, but I used alcohol inks on it one time, so it's all nice and stained. So I like to use this black one just because even if it does get stained from alcohol inks, you don't see it. But there we go. This is one of my favorite embossing folders because really you don't need to do a whole lot to it and it's just pretty. So that again, I would just put right onto the front of a card and I would put the sentiment on the inside. Here is that double embossed background, just very simply put onto the background of a card. And you could put a sentiment on the inside if you wanted. We're going to add some heat embossing to the embossed background. It's just a different way to color your embossing. So first thing we need to do is get that embossed background, and because I missed the paper, I need to let it dry completely before we add any embossing, because if we did the embossing while the paper was wet, the embossing powder would just stick to all the wet paper. And then as you can see, I just added some simple die cuts to the front, but let's get our embossed image first. So I'm using a brick folder for the background here. This is actually coordinations color or coordinations paper that I have left from many, many years ago. We're not going to see the black side, so it's going to be just fine. And again, you want to make sure to put your paper so that the bricks are the way you want them to be. We don't want to have our mortar part sticking out. No bottom plate, just the embossing folder and the top plate. Got my misting bottle in the way there. Let's get it out of the way. Put it through a couple times to get a nice deep embossing there. I love this folder because it's just got so much dimension to it. So I'm going to let that completely dry and I'll see you in a few minutes and we will start to emboss it. All right, our paper is dry and we are ready to start doing our technique on our background. So you're going to need an embossing pad. I've got a Versamark pad here. You just want some clear embossing ink and I'm just tapping it onto my background. And it's only going to go on those raised parts. So the cool thing is we're going to just get some natural looking grout, because this is a brick pattern, in those bricks. I've got 3 different embossing glazes here. Now embossing glazes are transparent. You don't necessarily need transparent embossing powder for this. It's just the colors that I had that I thought were going to be looking good for a brick wall. If you have opaque ones, or if you are using an embossing folder where some metallic ones would look cool, you absolutely can swap them out for different colors. I'm putting a few different colors just to make it a little bit more interesting. I think if I put all one color, especially for a brick, because when you see brick, it's got different shades and stuff like that, I think it would look a little bit, I just think this makes it look a little bit more interesting. So obviously, because I'm mixing some embossing powder here, once I'm done with this, I'm going to have an embossing powder mix. I'm not going to be able to put them back in those jars. So I have a jar that I keep the mixes in. If I'm working with just blues or greens or whatever, then I have a jar with just those color combinations or whatever. But you can see I don't have a ton of embossing powder on my thing here, and the extra I put right back on just to see if there's any spots that got missed. And I do that a couple times just to make sure that I've got all the embossing powder or the embossing ink covered. It just seems to fill in those edges there. Tap on the back to get all the excess off. Let's put this in the container so that I can clear my workspace off here. And I like to close my containers before I start embossing, because I don't want, even though an embossing gun more emits heat and doesn't blow air, I just don't want anything to blow or to melt while I'm doing it. So I close them and get them out of the way. I'm also a little bit klutzy, so I would tend to knock things and bump them. So once I'm done, I like to tilt it in the light to make sure that I got everything. I can see in the bottom I've missed some. There we go. I think we got it all. So from there, just glue it onto your card and just add your die cuts. This particular one, there's a lot of part that is raised. So when I glue it down, I like to glue along the little border lines to make sure that I have some glue that has some good contact with my card base. And then I also like to put an acrylic block or something to weigh it down to hold it, because as I've been embossing it, it's warped it a little bit. So by having a weight down, it's going to make sure that that piece has good contact with your card while the glue is drying. And after doing that, I find that I have no problems with things sticking or coming up after that. But you definitely want to make sure to have it laying flat. You could hold it flat as well, but I tend to get a little impatient, so I tend to put an acrylic block and then a weight. And by a weight, I mean I have a thing with just some marbles or whatever in it, so it doesn't need to be anything fancy. But there you go. And again, that can be done with any embossing folder or any colored embossing powder. The sky's the limit. For this one, I took some ivy die cuts and a bird, and this little birdie told me sentiment was just perfect with it. Alright, so for the next video, we're actually going to add some mica sprays to the concoction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray I'm going to spray on this side. This is where the image is recessed. So I'm going to spray some mica sprays, and then I'm going to use some paper towel and just wipe it off of the top, which would be the background part, and then I'm going to ink the background part. So you see that the sprays are concentrated on the raised part, but the cool thing about the sprays is they kind of beat up on the folder, so you still get some of the white cardstock showing through. It just adds some interest and texture as well as some sparkle. And then to make sure that it coordinated, my little butterfly die cut has the mica spray on it as well, so that it would coordinate with the spray in the embossing. So to start, I'm going to spray my spray, and I've shaken it a bit so I know it's mixed, but you do want to make sure that it's all mixed. The mica tends to settle at the bottom of your jar, so if you haven't mixed it, then you're just going to get liquid that's not shimmery. So I'm going to spray, and I'm fairly liberal with this because I do want to get a decent amount in those grooves. Now, unfortunately, all of this that I'm wiping off the top is going to be wasted. But what I'm trying to do by wiping that off the top is I'm trying to be able to get a clean surface, so when I go and ink with my ink pad, I'm not contaminating my ink pad with that mica spray. So there we go. Get it off my working surface as well. Let's go one more time. It's pretty good. It's coming off pretty dry. All right, so now I'm going to use my ink pad. I'm choosing a dark color because I want to be able to see a nice dark background with that shimmer spray on the front. And by on the front, I mean on the embossed part. So you can see I'm not contaminating my ink pad at all, so I don't have to be careful about doing this, and I don't have to worry about getting mica spray on my pad there. Let's mist our paper. This doesn't need to be here. I'm going to lay my paper down and then bring in my machine. Close your folder, try not to move the paper in there because again, we don't want to smudge our inks, and then go back and forth. Oops. There we go. So there we go. So I do still have ink in there. I can go back, mist some more paper, and do it again. What's going to happen is it's going to have a look like this. It's got most of the ink off of it, so it's just going to have a little bit of color on the back and then just a little bit of shimmer on the fronts. But again, this is all water soluble, so I will clean it off by running it through under the tap to get rid of all the excess on there, just because I tend to keep my folders as clean as possible so that I don't have any surprises if I'm working on a project. So this does need to be dried completely before you add it to a card. But isn't it fun how you get the shimmer in the raised part and then the background is inked? So that's what it's like when it's done. And unlike the brick embossing folder, this one here, there's a lot of flat areas, so it makes it easier to glue to the front of your card. I absolutely love how the spray on the butterfly just brings out the touch of spray in the embossed creases there. And then once again, just a simple sentiment. All right, so our embossed pieces of paper are dried. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them on top of each other and kind of shimmy them until the embossing matches, and it kind of clicks into place. It gets to the point where you can't move it anymore. I'm going to use some dye tape, and I'm going to hold it into the place. I want to trim both of them at the same time so that I have the embossing exactly where I want it to be, and I'm also going to trim it down to the size that I want for the card. So I want it to be 4 inches by 5 1/4. So I'm going to trim it down to that. So that edge is done. This one here is the one I want to cut, so I want to take that tape off of there. And then the other end doesn't have tape, so I can cut it already. And then this one, let's move the tape from here. Now I'm going to take one of these and I'm just going to cut it at a diagonal right there. So that will fit into right there once I've got it enhanced with the Inka Gold. So this is what the Inka Gold looks like. It's just a wax or a water-based wax. I'm going to use it just with my fingers. You don't need any tools with this. I'm just going to rub it all over the surface. I'm using a very light touch because I don't want this entire thing to be gold. I only want to be enhancing the surface that is raised. If this looks interesting, I have a class that's just devoted to wax paste techniques that has all sorts of different other things that you can use Inka Gold for. But I love that you only need to use your finger, and it's water soluble. So anything that goes onto my surface here, anything that goes onto my finger just gets washed right off, and it dries super, super quick. So you see me going into the container regularly. That's only because it's already dried on my finger. So, and a little bit goes a long way. I've had this for years. So I'm going to glue this in place. So that this glue can be drying while I work on the next step. Because we've already matched exactly that embossing, there's no work to getting it to match. So the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted a gold line for separation, and you could use gold cardstock for it, but we already have something. We know that if I use this, it's going to 100% match. So let's just use this. So I could cut this strip down to the size I want first and then add the Inka Gold, but then it's going to be a little bit harder to apply it, as well as the fact that I'm going to be struggling not bending the paper. So I'm just going to put it on this black piece of cardstock and then I will trim it down. I want to make sure that I've got a length that's long enough for my card plus a little bit extra for the angle. So there we go. Oops. Let's move this to the side. I'm just going to grab a paper towel here, or not a paper towel, a baby wipe here, and just quickly wipe my hands so that I'm not transferring gold anywhere. It probably wouldn't transfer simply because it's already dried on my hand, but let's get it all cleaned up before we move on. This can go. I have a little chunk of the gold there that I just smeared around, and now dry it before we do anything else. All right, now this piece here, I'm going to use my small trimmer for this, cut it down, and then I'm going to use the lines on my ruler here to get an even strip. And there we go. So I could even take my ruler, it's going to be a little bit harder now that I've trimmed it, and even make it narrower if I want, because I can see through that ruler. I can see if it's straight, and I tend to eyeball this type of stuff, especially when it's within the ruler, because there's no ruler there to measure it by. And I keep saying ruler, but I mean the guard there. So now we've got our thinner strip. Let's put some glue on our card. And by card, what I actually mean is just embossed piece. Place that down there. And I would typically let it dry first. But it doesn't necessarily have to. So I'm just going to take some scissors and just snip it with the edge of the card so that it lines up. And then simply add it to a card base and put your sentiment on there. Just a fun way to enhance that embossing. And it just goes to show you don't only need to emboss on white cardstock, absolutely emboss on black, because it just shows up a little bit different. All right, so for this card, we're going to use the same folder we used for the last one, but we're going to use a different type of metallic to enhance it. We're going to use some Foundry wax. So Foundry wax is a liquid leafing wax that comes in a bottle, and you rub it on I'm going to do it with my fingers as well. You could use a brush, but for something like this, I like to use my fingers because I like to feel exactly where it's going. And then you use a heat gun to bring the leafing to the surface. So the very first step to this is we are going to need to emboss our paper. So I have the same black watercolor cardstock that I used for the last card, and you could use regular black cardstock. I just really like the way this one looks. I like the color of black, and I just like the look of it embossed. To me, it just looks a little bit richer. And then once again, because we wet it to emboss it, I need to let it completely dry before we move on to the next step. So I'm going to take this out of the folder. Beautiful embossed image. I'm going to lay it down and I'm going to let it dry probably like 5-ish to 10 minutes. It doesn't take a long time because we didn't use a lot of water, but we want it dry before we go to the next step. All right, so my cardstock is all completely dry. I'm going to take my Foundry wax and squirt some onto my table here. I'm going to only do a little bit at a time. It does dry quite quickly. So as you can see while I'm working it, it gets a little bit thicker, a little bit thicker. So I'm just going to try to be light-handed. Works better if you squeeze or if you swirl it and then take some of the excess off of your hands on your work surface. Like I said, it dries super, super quick. It also is super easy cleanup, but not with water. Cleanup for this is with alcohol. So you can use some isopropyl alcohol, some hand sanitizer. And for some techniques, you can even thin it with some isopropyl and use that to flick around dots and get some spots on your projects. I have a bunch of different projects using the Foundry wax on my YouTube. It's something that's just come out in the last few months, and quite frankly, I have a hard time not putting it on almost every project. So at this point, I've just put it around on the surface. I would trim it down before I do the next step, and I didn't do it on this card. I just trimmed it down and left the edges as is. If you wanted to put some around the edges, you could easily just do that like that and put some around the edges to clean it up. This is just some hand sanitizer, which is alcohol based. Get it off my finger and then get it off your work surface. Super easy cleanup. I'm gonna put a little bit more down because I see a little bit left there. So like I said before, in order to bring the leafing out in it, you need to use a heat gun. And it works very similarly to embossing with embossing powder, but actually quicker. So it starts out dull, and then as you move the heat gun along it, you'll see the shine from the leafing wax. There we go, and it's quick as that. So it doesn't get super shiny in all areas. Some areas where it's thicker, you'll see more of the leafing. And then along this edge where I put it, you'll see a little bit more of the leafing. But just a fun way to, again, to enhance the embossing. The one thing I'm not sure if I remember or if I said, you can hear a ball in there. You want to make sure that you shake it really, really well before you use it, because there are parts there that do settle, and you want to make sure it's mixed up really, really well. And this is on paper. You don't need to only do it on paper. You could put it on metal, you could put it on plastic, you put it on all sorts of different surfaces, but just a fun way, again, to enhance your embossed images. So for this technique, we're going to create a grungy metal look. And we're going to do that with both the embossing folder as well as different embossing powders. So I'm using a matte silver, and when I say matte, I mean not super shiny. This one here, I tried on some glossy silver mirror cardstock, and it looks completely different from the sample, and the technique is not nearly as effective. So you definitely want to have a matte silver background in order for that embossing, as well as all that detail from the embossing powder to show through. So this side is coated, so I don't need to spray mist any water on this side, but I am going to mist it on this side, just to make that side a little bit more flexible. And once again, for this one, look at your paper, because you're going to want to have your gears laid out right. No bottom plate, just the top plate. Let's get the machine out of the way. And technically we could continue, because this side of the paper is not wet. This side is, though. It's got a little bit of moisture to it. So I'm going to let that dry before we start going and adding some embossing powder. If I do it right now, some of that powder is going to start sticking on the back here, and it's just going to make a little bit of a mess. So we're going to let that dry for a few minutes, and I'll be right back. All right, so the first step in creating our grungy metal background here is I'm going to take some StazOn ink, and I'm just going to rub it all over the background. I'm not pressing super hard, I'm pressing fairly light. But we're just going to get some dark areas there. Some of this is going to be covered with the embossing powder. Some of it's going to be visible. So I'll move that paper because it's grungy and inky. And now I'm going to take some Versamark ink. The StazOn dries super quick, so I may get a little bit on my pad, but this is my stained pad anyway, so I'm not super worried about it. So you want to choose what areas you want to have some gold on. We're not rubbing it over the entire thing because we don't want gold over all of those edges. We only want it on some. So let's see where we got our ink. I'm going to pour the ink or the embossing powder on there, and I actually pretty much like the way it landed. If you get any straight lines, just take a soft brush and gently brush that embossing powder, and it will come off. So nothing is permanent until you heat set it with the embossing gun. And I typically like most stuff, I just don't like any straight lines, because that's, I mean, as natural as this is, it's not natural. So I'm going to put that powder back in there. I'm going to rub any embossing powder that's stuck to that piece of paper, because we're going to be using some bronze powder next, and I don't want them mixed. I'm going to heat set this first. Can't put the Versamark on and then do the bronze powder now, because this isn't heat set. If I start putting or rubbing my pad over, I'm just going to rub this right off. As you can tell, while I was doing that, my cardstock curved. That's totally fine. When it gets to the point where we're at the end, we'll make sure to flatten it. And when I glue it onto my card base, I will just put a acrylic block and some weight down there to flatten it. All right, and at this point, just check it over quickly just to make sure that everything that can be embossed is embossed. Because once again, we don't want to start rubbing our embossing pad over top of it and move the powder. All right, so now we're going to put our pad on, and we're going to put bronze over this, whatever areas we get highlighted this area, or with this bit of embossing powder, or embossing ink. There we go. And if I didn't find, after that first time, if I didn't find that I had enough gold on there, I could easily go back and add some more gold. I'm getting low on my bronze powder. Copper powder would work as well. This is powder that I've had for, I want to say probably 20 years. It's been a long time. I've got it a long time ago. So it doesn't go bad. It lasts a long time. All right. I'm going to rub off that as well because I don't want any of that ink or that powder on there. This here, I ended up getting just a big blob and I don't like that, so I'm going to take some of that off. And here I've got some straight edges that I'm going to soften. And like I said, now's the time, if you've got some edges you don't really like, to soften them. Once it's melted on, you can't take anything away. At this point, you can take whatever you want away. There we go. So if you want, you can go back and add some more gold. You can go back and add some more bronze. I think I'm actually going to add a little bit more bronze kind of in this area here. That's kind of nothing in there. The other thing you can do is you can tell that it only goes on the most raised areas. Any of these really back parts, it doesn't go on. So you could take embossing re-inker and you can paint it on the areas that you want it on, but just keep in mind that it's going to end up being heavier than if you had just rubbed an ink pad on. So you can do it, but it is going to end up looking a little bit heavy, so be prepared for that, just because you have a little bit, it puts more ink on it basically. And I think I'm going to leave that like that. The last step, if you wanted though and wanted more of the gold and the copper metal, you absolutely could add more to it. You get to choose how much or how little you want on there. So the last step I'm going to do is put that black on there again, just to get a bit more grunginess in there, a little bit more of the dark. It just enhances it, and it also just, I don't know, it just brings it to life almost. There we go. And because it's permanent, you can use it on a non-porous surface, like the embossing powder, like the metal paper, and it's permanent. So there we go. And then, like I said before, I just put it on a card and added a sentiment, just left the embossed image to be the main focal point of the card. I absolutely love how this one turned out. Perfect if you have a mechanic in the family or just someone that absolutely loves steampunk. Don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell notification to be notified of more videos.